When we're talking about enterprise threat mitigation, the first thing I want everyone to think of, and some people already said it inside the chat, the first thing you want to think of is big company. Anytime you hear the term enterprise, it represents a large organization or a business that has a lot of moving parts. So think of the opposite of an enterprise. The opposite of an enterprise is like a mom and pop shop or a small business, such as like a pizzeria that's been operating in one location for the past 20 years. It's operated by a family and they have a pretty rudimentary network system. But when you're talking about an enterprise, we think like Amazon, Google, SAP. These are ginormous companies that have very sophisticated networks, a very sophisticated infrastructure. We'll talk a bit more about what the term infrastructure means, but the first thing I want you to understand is anytime you hear the term enterprise, it means a big company. All of you kind of hit the nail on the head when you were talking about threat mitigation, because it essentially means strategies or steps that you can take to reduce risk. So in this sense, we're talking about reducing the impact and likelihood of a threat. Remember, there's a saying in cybersecurity that it's not if you get hacked, it's when. So what you can do is increase your security posture. In essence, your security posture is your overall security strength or readiness in case a security event were to take place. You want to increase your security posture and reduce the likelihood and impact of a threat happening. The reason why you want to do that is because if a threat is going to happen, you might as well want to have safeguards in place that'll essentially lower the chances of that event happening, or if the event does happen, at least the scope of the impact will be minimalized. So in today's class, we'll talk a bit more about what that looks like, how to reduce the impact, how to reduce the likelihood, some steps to take in order to ensure that like your business is a fortress. Think of it as like a castle. And then the gold or the thing that people want to get to is in the center of the castle. If you think of the castle being at the center, well, then there are steps that you can take in order to protect it. So here, let's look at this castle mode diagram. So as you can see here, this is the basic structure of a castle. So here you have the actual castle, right? And then around the castle, you have what we call a moat. A moat is like a water. Back in the medieval days, this water was meant to keep people from being able to cross and then attack the castle. Then you have a wall. Then you have like things on top of the wall. You have towers. The people typically have archers up there. Typically, there's also an inner circle of a castle. Now, all of these are layers to a castle that'll essentially protect it. If the castle is the enterprise, well, then the enterprise is going to have specific layers to protect the gold or protect the king and queen in the very center. So the entire purpose of enterprise threat mitigation is to increase your security posture, which means the overall strength of your organization, and reduce the likelihood and impact if something were to take place. Okay, so you might be saying, all right, that's great. Well, why is that? Why is that important? Well, for one, in today's culture, when we're talking about protecting against attackers, they don't just come through the front door. It's not like they just say, oh, we're just gonna grab this from the front door. They become sophisticated. They try to sneak in through back doors. They try to sneak in through windows. They try to find the weakest links in your organization. So in order to find those, you need to take proactive steps. Okay. That's why enterprise threat mitigation is important. For one, it's regarding protecting the thing that's most important to the organization, which is sensitive information. When you are a company, you owe it to your customers or people's whose data you are storing or processing to protect it properly. An example is if, for example, let's say you give your data to Google, right? Google has a lot of really great cybersecurity features and a lot of things in place to protect your data. But just imagine if they mishandled your data. Imagine if they had a major leak and your financial details were released. By financial details, I'm talking about maybe your credit card information. Give me 1 second. Okay. And I'm talking about your credit card information or potentially your um, customer, your email, your address, all the names of everyone that you care about. If that information were to get out into the public, it could be sold, it could harm people's lives. Remember, something I keep saying is the number one rule for cybersecurity is to protect human life. So you want to protect that sensitive information. Not only is it to protect your customers, but it's also going to cost you and your company millions of dollars if there were to be a breach. It is very expensive. The other thing you want to do is maintain what we call business continuity. We'll talk about this a bit more, but business continuity sits under the umbrella of what we call resilience. Resilience is all about making sure that if an event were to take place, your business and your business operations and functions can still continue. There's something called a BCP. BCP stands for a business continuity plan. The business continuity plan is essentially a blueprint or a document that shows all the steps that the manager and the teams have to take in order to make sure that they can continue the business. Okay. We'll talk about this a bit more down the line. And then we have compliance. Now, compliance and regulations, in very simple terms, is following any standards, any rules, or any laws that are specific to your industry. For example, if you were to work in B2B sales, there are things like SOC 2 that you want to adhere to. There are things like ISO 27001. There's a bunch of different regulations that you have to make sure that you follow in order to stay compliant. Why is it important to stay compliant? Because the more compliant you are, the more you're able to build trust. Okay. So at the end of the day, like I said, one of the important things to do is to be able to understand different pieces of threat mitigation, and we'll break it down in such a way that it's easy for you to explain to someone else. So let me kind of paint you a picture. So an example is, let's say there's a hospital, and inside that hospital, they experience what we call a ransomware, meaning that all of their computer systems are unable to work, and maybe some of the computer systems that are connected to the internet that they use for operations are no longer functioning. So, because they're no longer functioning, that actually puts patients' lives in danger. Maybe it happened in the middle of an operation or a surgery because the system is down or unusable. Because of that, that means that there were not any good mitigation steps in place, which means that this could have been avoided. Now, the damages are going to be pretty severe, and there's going to be a lot of financial costs, reputational costs, and potentially life lost. So, enterprise threat mitigation, which a hospital would be considered an enterprise, could have avoided this altogether. Now, whether it would be completely unavoidable, I don't think would be accurate. However, it could at least have lowered the impact. Point two mentions hospital shutdown by ransomware attacks. Oh, yep, exactly that. Thank you, Ben. So that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. Now, there are two different types of threat mitigation. So the first one is reactive, the other one is proactive. We're going to break these down pretty intimately as we go through some of these other slides. But one of the first things that you want to understand is, by definition, reactive threat mitigation just means responding to an incident after it has happened. Right? So if an incident happens, well, then you have to respond to it in very specific ways. A very simple example is, if there were to be an incident, let's say, for example, in Bangkok, we had a recent earthquake. In that earthquake, we had to respond to it in a certain capacity. One of those responses, even if it wasn't a cybersecurity incident, one of those responses is disaster recovery. We had to make sure that all of our systems were up and running, that we didn't lose any data, all that. We need to make sure that everything was operational and that we didn't lose anything. That is called reactive because in reactive, there's an event that happened and we take specific steps to address or to respond. Typically, when we're talking about reactive threat mitigation, if it's a cybersecurity incident, meaning that there's data loss or something, well, then there would be a team called the Security Operations Center that's called the SOC, SOC, and they're the ones who respond if there's a certain incident. They react to it. They're also known as the blue team. So in cybersecurity, you have blue team and red team. The red team are the good guy hackers, and they get paid to hack organizations and then tell the organization these are the things that you need to change in order to be more secure and increase security posture. The reactive team is typically called the blue team. The blue team are the ones who respond to certain incidences. So Peter said, would the hostile not go to backup right away once discovered? Peter, that's a really good point. Yes, they typically would. So a lot of hospitals tend to have backups on backups on backups. If they have a really good IT team, well, they have what we call redundancy. Redundancy means that they have a backup. If that backup fails, they have another backup. If that backup fails, another backup. This is something called RAID 1, 2, and 3. You can look that up on your own, but a lot of hospitals will typically have this in place. Believe it or not, however, unfortunately, the three most targeted, I'll say the two most targeted and most vulnerable industries or institutions to cyber attacks are hospitals and schools. The reason is because they're so busy protecting or educating people or saving lives that sometimes IT becomes an afterthought. There are still some hospitals that operate on very, very old machines that are not patched, which we'll talk about a little later. All right. Okay. Now, that is reactive. Blue team, the Security Operations Center. Then we have what we call proactive. So proactive mitigation are essentially steps that you can take before there's any sort of incident. Now, something to keep in mind with proactive. This is these are steps you take in the moment of peace. The way I like to think of it is if you're a medieval nation and there's currently peace, but you know that there's a neighboring country that's building up their army, a proactive step is you building up your own army and setting up scouts at the edge of your border. So this is to see if they're trying to do an attack. If they do, well, then you'll know about it. So proactive threat mitigation is essentially putting strategies, putting controls in place in case it were to happen. We'll talk about those a bit more. Now, some different categories regarding reactive versus proactive threat mitigation. The first one, we have timing. The reactive happens after an incident has occurred or there's been a breach. Reactive is implementing security steps before any sort of incident happens. This typically happens in moment of peace, moment of silence when there's really nothing going on. And then there's the focus area. So their goal here is to minimize the impact because keep in mind with reactive, an incident has already occurred. So the first thing you want to do is you want to contain the incident so that it doesn't become worse. The goal of reactive is not to let the incident become worse, but to lessen the impact. The goal of proactive is to prevent an incident from happening entirely or minimize the likelihood. An example is vulnerability assessment. If you do a vulnerability assessment, well, then you find a vulnerability in your company and then you mitigate that vulnerability by either patching it, getting rid of the vulnerability altogether. If you get rid of it, well, then you prevent it entirely. This is something called risk mitigation, which we'll talk about. So the nature of it is just addressing specific threats. The nature of proactive is strategic. It's where you focus on setting the controls in place. Incident response, we've talked about in class before. As a reminder, an incident response plan is a playbook or a list of steps to take if an incident were to happen. Why do I bring this up? Because when we're talking about incidences, typically there's an adrenaline going. I've been through several instances, and I can tell you that there's a lot of adrenaline, there's a lot of emotions, there's heightened heightened energy, right? So in this case, when there's heightened energy like this, well, you have to make sure that you have an easy to follow plan. An example of this, I worked at a company once where they had an incident response plan that was just a one sheet. In that one sheet, it said, if there's an incident, reach out to this person, create this Slack channel, make a summary of the incident, make timestamps, make sure to have updates every 5 to 10 minutes, if not sooner. And it's essentially like a step-by-step process to make sure that we understand what's happening. Then there's threat intelligence. That's just data that helps the organization know what exactly happened. Then we already talked about disaster recovery. We already talked about business continuity. So these are all things that happen in response to an incident. When it comes to the proactive one, it's making policies, procedures, making sure there's endpoint protection, which we'll talk about, access control, which we'll also talk about, and then the benefits we already discussed. Okay. Thank you, Nora, for answering that question. All right, so let's dive a bit deeper into proactive threat mitigation. Now, proactive is the steps that you take before a problem happens. Now, something that I want to be upfront with you all on. When you get into the cybersecurity world, when you actually start working, know that sometimes this can be a blocker because the business is interested in doing things that have an immediate impact. When you're talking about proactive threat mitigation, at times the organization or leadership will say, oh, it's never happened before, so we don't have to plan for it. Oh, that never happened, or we have really good security. I don't think this is that important. I want you all to hear from me that I'm giving you permission to push back on it and say, well, I think that we should focus on proactive threat mitigation because if an incident happens and we get audited or the board of directors said, why weren't these security measures put in place? Well, then that's not a good look. That means that we did not prioritize security and in essence, we did not respond ethically to the customers whose data we're trying to protect. So you want to make sure to push for proactive threat mitigation. Now, there's a balance there. This is why I say that cybersecurity is a humanistic industry, because yes, you're working with technology, but you also have to balance compliance with convenience. If you, let's say, if you live in a country where you never get floods, right? Well, do you need to have a policy for flood control, or do you need to have a disaster recovery plan for floods? In this case, it's not something that you would really want to do because it takes up time and resources that you don't essentially need, okay? But you do want to take steps like basic access control or something like what we call EDR. EDR stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. It's essentially monitoring or checking all of your devices for any suspicious activity. It's as if if you have a company device, well, then the IT team and the IT security team monitors it in case there's any suspicious activity. A suspicious activity could be if someone tries to plug in a USB and steal data from your computer. Okay. Um, is my voice lagging or okay. All right, so I'm good for now. All right. Good to know. Okay. So one of the steps that you can take for proactive threat mitigation is exactly this, EDR. EDR is when you continually monitor the computers because understand this, when you have a work computer, it is not your personal computer. When you get that work computer, you essentially sign something called an acceptable use policy, an AUP. That means that you're saying because I have this computer, I won't put personal things on it. I won't use it as my own personal computer. I'll only use it for work. Okay. The reason why they have EDR on it, which is endpoint detection and response, is so that if there's anything suspicious that happens on that computer, well, then they can take actions. Now, the point here is it's endpoint detection and response. Now, endpoint detection and response is specifically on the endpoint, which is users' computers, right? Then there's something called security policies and procedures. This should be something that you've seen before. What that means is they have different policies or written documents that say these are the steps that you need to take for XYZ. Okay. So a company has all these different things. One of the important things that they have is an information security policy. So the information security policy states all of the things that are required to make sure that the auditor or the company or anyone internal knows exactly what is considered like sensitive information, what's considered high risk information. It means that if a laptop is stolen, well, then the thief can't access the device because the data is encrypted. It has what we call very specific rules and regulations that say this is how we're protecting our company. Another one is compliance. Now, as I said before, compliance in this case are industry standards or regulations that you want to follow in order to build trust and be more secure. Something important to understand here, not many cybersecurity professionals really think about this, but when it comes to proactive threat mitigation, one of the best things you can do is become compliant with one of these standards. The reason why is because when you become compliant, well, then that compliance standard is already forcing you and your team to set all of these controls and all of these proactive security benchmarks in order to protect you and your business. So one of the best ways to do proactive threat mitigation is to become compliant. An example of that is PCI DSS. So PCI DSS stands for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. What does that mean? In very simple terms, if you're processing any type of payment, such as credit card information, you should be PCI DSS certified. The reason why is because they dictate how specifically you're storing that payment information, how you're processing it, who has access to it. This is all things that you need to do in order to protect that payment information. Then you have access control. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. This is an important one. This is one of the things that I do. It's security awareness. It's essentially teaching your staff on how to be more secure. The reason why this is important is because keep in mind that cybersecurity is not just a job for the IT team and the security team. Cybersecurity is the entire company's job. This is why I always advocate for a culture of security because everyone owns a piece of it. Another reason why is because 80% of incidents that happen, whether on purpose or not, are due to the weakest link in cybersecurity, which is humans. So, security awareness training is one of the best ways to protect you and your company from an incident happening. One of the primary things that's done with security awareness is something called a phishing simulation. So, a reminder, a phishing email is an email that is trying to get you to click a link or download something. More often than not, it tends to be malicious. So, the reason why it's important is because phishing and ransomware are still two of the biggest incidences or the two biggest vulnerabilities or hacks that happen because they're so easy to do. So security awareness typically involves that. Network segmentation, we'll talk about that a little later. Secure coding practices. Now, if you're a non-technical person, to simplify this in easy terms, whenever you write software or whenever you're coding something, um, you want to make sure that you're not coding it just for it to do a function. You want to make sure that it's doing the function securely. A very simple example is if I write code for a program, and that program is essentially meant to, let's say, collect user information, analyze the data, and then email them specific recommendations. I can write code that does that, but if I write code and says, hey, collect these user information and store it in plain text on this server, that's considered unsecure code because then it's essentially collecting it in plain text. And then if a hacker were able to see the traffic between them, well, then it would become unsecure. They could steal that information. So secure coding practices is essentially making sure you're taking the right steps. Another example here that I definitely want to emphasize is when you are filling out information on a website. So you know when you get on a website and then you have like a form you can type into. Well, sometimes those forms can be manipulated and then you can input specific scripts to take action on the back end. So you need to have what we call a validation. The validation is essentially saying if you're asking for an email, it won't accept anything unless it's an email format. So text at da 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 da. If it's anything but that, if it includes very specific characters that aren't email specific, it won't allow you to send that information in. So that's an example of it. So we already talked about some of the benefits of proactive threat. But one of the things that it does is it does reduce the likelihood and impact of a threat if it were to take place. That means it reduces the risk. Another part is I already spoke about the term resilience. That means that if an incident were to happen, you already have proactive steps in order to address it. So what that does is it minimizes downtime, it minimizes impact. If one of the servers were impacted, well, then all the other servers won't be. Then it saves costs. There's improved compliance. Improved compliance means that you are essentially building trust and credibility with your stakeholders, with your customers. You're already taking proactive steps. You can advertise all over the place that you are certified in XYZ, and then you have competitive advantage. So here, let's take an example. So here we have a company, and this company is very secure because they do process payment information. So we have PCI DSS. If we want to download and view their certification or what we call their attestation, well, then we can download it here, but you'd have to log in and sign an NDA. They're ISO 27001 certified. They're SOC certified as well. So this SOC is different from the Security Operations Center. It stands for Service Organizational Controls. So this SOC is without getting too deep into it, the SOC is a certification that's actually being mandated by a certified body called AICPA. Now, CPA, if you heard of it before, that's Certified Public Accountants. It is a it is a regulation by accountants because it is meant to protect like financial information. However, they have a whole section where they cover very specific security controls because it is a part of protecting finances. So this is an example of all the certifications that can exist or all of the compliance standards that exist out there. The next one is competitive advantage. So if you're more secure, that just means that you have an edge over your competition. Okay. If GUI company is hacked and sensitive information about credit card and social security numbers is stolen by the hackers, how can GUI company reclaim the sensitive information or delete it from the hackers' computers? So that's a very good question, Ahmed. So here's the thing. When it comes to data being lost, it becomes very, very difficult to get it back. More often than not, you have to include law enforcement. You'd have to include, like in the United States, you can include the FBI or a forensics team to scrub that information. Um, but at the end of the day, it's very hard to get that information back because once it's breached, the hackers, once they have that information, what they'll most often do is they'll make like several copies of it and put it in several different places. So it becomes very difficult to find that information and delete it completely. Well, now this is why proactive threat mitigation is so important, which we'll talk about later is one of the things you have to do is encrypt it. When you encrypt data or when you encrypt stolen information, people aren't able to access it without a security key. So even if they do steal that information, if it's encrypted, well, then they can't open it. Okay. So that's one of the reasons why proactive threat mitigation is important. Let's carry on here. Now, let's talk about some very fundamental pieces of cybersecurity. Keep this in mind. If anyone is going to ask you, hey, what is an element of cybersecurity that's really important? One of the first things that should come to your mind is access control. Access control is simply deciding who can see or who can use different things in an organization. A very simple example is if you work in IT, you need to have access to the different IT devices in order to configure it. You need to have access to the Wi-Fi to change it. Now, if you work in marketing, there's no reason why you need to have access to the Wi-Fi configuration tool, or if you need, there's no reason why you need admin privileges to all the IT tools. This is called the concept of the principle of least privilege, which we'll talk about. But access control is one of the most important things in cybersecurity because you're essentially choosing and setting what we call permissions to allow someone to see something and use something or not. A permission is just what someone can do and what they can't do. More often than not, permissions involved if someone can read it, write, or delete it. Because in essence, everything needs to have some sort of access control. A very simple thing is your email or even your computer or your phone. Your phone has access control, meaning that you're the only one who knows the passcode. Only your face or your fingerprint can open it. That is a form of access control. If I get a hold of your phone, I can't look at it because I'm not you. I don't have the password. I don't have the knowledge. Meaning that is a form of access control that's not allowing me to see it. Okay. Now, why is that important? Well, for one, if we put this in the context of enterprise, right? If you remember, we're trying to protect sensitive data. When you're trying to protect sensitive data, that means information such as like banking information, personal PII data, which stands for personally identifiable information, passwords, or customer records. That's what you're trying to protect. So one of the ways you can protect that is to prevent unauthorized access, meaning only certain people need access to this information. Everyone else does not. Without the proper permissions on sensitive data, that means that maybe anyone can have access to it. Believe me, I've seen some companies where they don't have any access control at all. They say, hey, no, everyone has access to this. We want everyone to have access because they need to access this file for their work. Well, then what that does is it means everyone can access. If there was an employee that became upset, they could steal that information and sell it to a competitor. So you only want the right people to have access. Another reason is because it limits damage. Now, if let's say something were to be breached, or if there were something that an incident were to happen, well, that threat actor won't have access to certain servers if there is access control in place. That means that it's restricted to only certain people. And then compliance with regulations. There are a bunch of regulations out there that exist to protect information or to require access control. This is one of the fundamental pieces of cybersecurity is when they say, hey, what's an element of cybersecurity that everyone needs to do? Access control. Now, to get a bit more technical into what access control looks like, this jumps into what we call networking a little bit, but stay with me. We're going to simplify this and make this easy to understand. There is something that we call an access control list. So an access control list, otherwise known as an ACL, is essentially a list that shows us who has access to what. Okay. So it's kind of like a rule book in a sense, right? I like to think of it as a list, an invite list. So if you're going to like a party or something, well then there's a bouncer in the front and they say, "Hey, are you on the list?" Same thing. An access control list is essentially a list saying, is this IP address able or allowed to jump in or not? Can the IT team deploy a unified threat management to prevent employee access prohibited web services? Uh, Quabena, very good question. Yeah, that's actually something that's pretty common in the cybersecurity field. There are a lot of different UTMs that can be done. There are a lot of different solutions similar to that. Some of them are newer generation, and we'll talk about that a bit more, but great question. So now what is included in an access control list? Well, in essence, an access control list is looking at three things. They're looking at, hey, who's the person that's trying to access this resource? In this case, and then they also ask, what resource are they trying to access? Is it a service? Is it a file? Is it an application? And then what can they do with that resource? So when it comes to access control, you want to know who's doing it, what are they trying to reach, like what are they trying to use, and then what are they trying to do? These are the three questions that an access control list does. And you have to think about this as a cybersecurity professional because there are different scenarios where there could be different answers. Maybe the user is a marketing intern. They're trying to access their design application, but the only thing they can do is read it. They can't actually change it because they don't want the intern actually changing any marketing templates. Or it could be an IT admin. An IT admin is trying to get to their switch, and the switch is a network device that switches lanes on where data or traffic is going. And then they're trying to update the access control list. So all of these are questions that the ACL is trying to understand. Now, a new thing that you need to understand when it comes to an access control list, there is what we call an allow list. An allow list is essentially a list of all of the entities. In this case, the entities would be in maybe in these are entities or computers or devices that are allowed to access certain features. And then there's what we call a not allow list or a block list. Okay. They used to be called whitelisting and then blacklisting, but we're doing away with those terms. Instead, we're calling them allow list and disallow list. So, what are some benefits of an ACL? For one, it's an additional layer of granular control. That means that it's very detailed in the sense that it gets very specific by asking these three questions. Another piece of it is because it's flexible. With an ACL, we have something called a dynamic ACL. So a dynamic ACL essentially learns who's allowed and not allowed and dynamically adds them to that list. Now, that's typically pretty normal now in 2025, but there's still some old access control lists where you have to add them manually or and whatnot. And the last one is scalable because it's easy to manage. Typically, you'll have a controlled location where an ACL goes through. All right. Now, as I said before, an access control is one of the most fundamental pieces of cybersecurity. And ACL, it's like I said, it's like a bouncer who has a list that says, hey, are you allowed in or not? Now, another piece of access control is something called MFA. That stands for multi-factor authentication. I'm sure most of you have run into this. Anytime you're asked to log in and they say, hey, we're sending you a code to your email or your phone, that's considered multi-factor authentication. So it's an extra layer. Before, several years ago, all you had to do was give your username, password, and you're in. Now, if you're a threat actor, you somehow find the username and password, well, then you have access to that person's entire file. Now, the opposite is if you have multi-factor authentication, well, then that hacker needs to have your phone or access to your email in order to get that information. Now, something that I've heard from the red team is that if they're trying to hack a company, they get to a username and password, they have someone's username and password. The minute they do that and it asks for multi-factor authentication, they'll stop trying to hack them and say, "Oh, let's skip this one. They have MFA. Let's go to someone else." That's just a prime example showing that if you have MFA, it already reduces the likelihood of you getting hacked because hackers don't want to deal with MFA. This one simple step that may add 1 to 2 minutes in your login time is already a way to protect yourself. For me, I have MFA on everything, absolutely everything. And for me, I think I've shown this to the class before. Let me make sure you all can see it. So here, I don't know if you can see that. That is a YubiKey. I'm sure you've heard about it before, but it's essentially a key that has um, a very specific string in there, like a very specific password. No one else in the world has this. This is unique to me. So that means that only I'm able to log into my devices if I have this. No one else can. It's very, very secure. Now, the bad thing is if you lose this, well, then it's not good. Okay. So a piece of being a cybersecurity professional is you do have to actually walk the walk. You can't just talk the talk. The reason why I have this on here is because I have my headphones with me, which is something I bring everywhere. And then I also have my motorcycle keys. So I never leave the house with any of these. So I always know where these are at all times. That's an example of using MFA. All right. Now I think we touched on this last time, but there is something called the concept of least privilege. To put it quite simply, the principle of least privilege is just saying only give people access to what they need in order to do their job. They don't need more. Only give access to what they need. They don't need any more access more than that. And then there's a concept of zero trust. So zero trust is just assuming that no one is safe until they prove who they are. A very simple concept that I like to think of when I think of zero trust is never trust, always verify. An example of this is I used to work at a company where our president, he would walk around every morning and fist bump everyone saying, good morning, good morning. And if he sees someone he doesn't know, he's like, hey, would you mind telling me your name? Who you here to see? And are you a new employee? And he's just checking. He's doing it very nicely and politely, but this is a concept of zero trust where it's never trust, always verify. Now, you don't have to be rude about it. There was a time when I was walking into a building, I didn't have my badge, and someone stopped me and said, hey, do you happen to have your badge? I'm like, oh, yeah, it's in my bag. Sorry. And so he was like, oh, yeah, go ahead. So I was able to walk in. I commended him because at the time I was a contractor. And so I told his boss that he did a good job keeping the company secure. But that's all these privileges. Never trust, always verify. I think that covers this. I don't think we need to touch too much on it. Now, I'll mention this very briefly. There is something called RBAC. RBAC stands for Role-Based Access Control. In very simple terms, it just means if you're a salesperson, you only have access to sales things. If you're a marketing person, you only have access to marketing things. There is no reason a salesperson should have access to all HR records, including social security number, address of employees, that kind of stuff. Instead, they should only have access to the things that are required for their role. That's all RBAC is, role-based access control. Now, the benefits of least privilege is it's a way to reduce the attack surface. So that means that if a threat actor were to compromise one of the accounts, well, then they can't compromise any other accounts because that person only has access to the things they need to do their role. That's it. Because if they had any more privileges, then it would make a bigger impact. And the way you implement this is by RBAC, which is essentially setting permissions that says you can only access XYZ. Give me 1 second. Okay. Now, then we have zero trust, which you already talked about. Never trust, always verify. So you can do this by doing MFA. So if someone logs in, you shouldn't just be like, oh, they got the correct username and password. Great, we trust them. Instead, you want to add MFA. Just be like, hey, looks like you typed in the right username and password. However, we just want to double check. So we're going to go ahead and ask you to also give us the code that we sent to your email. This is typically done if you're trying to log in from a different device at weird hours at like 3 o'clock in the morning, or when you're trying to log in from a location or an IP address that isn't typical. An example is if you log in to, let's say, your bank from your home Wi-Fi every day, well then, if you go to some place like India or maybe even like Denmark and you try to log in, well then they're going to say, hey, you're logging in with the right username and password, but you're in a different location. We see that you're logging in from different locations. So we just want to double check that. Okay. Then there's encryption. There's also something called micro network segmenting. It's just adding an extra layer. It's like saying, um, let's say for example, Benjamin Long has a computer, right? And if we're doing network segmentation, we'd say, okay, Benjamin, you have access to just you and these resources. Microsegmenting says, hey, Benjamin, since you're only working on this one project, you only have access to this specific server. That is kind of like making it very, very rudimentary, but that's an example of that. For the sake of time, I have a couple more slides I want to go to. Okay. So remember when I said there was like the old term is whitelist and blacklist? You still might hear those nowadays, but the more accepted term now is allow list and block list. Okay. So that's all it is. And it's the same thing that we had already talked about. The only difference is that it's specifically about applications. Okay. Now, there is, I think we had talked about this in the past class. There's something called IT ghosting. So that means using applications that aren't allowed. Application allow lists are a set of applications that you can use that have been vetted by the IT and security team to be able to for you to use inside the organization. Now, an example is if you need to convert a PDF from or a Word document into a PDF, and for some reason you don't have that feature, well, then sometimes people will upload it onto a free PDF converter and download it. That is very dangerous because a lot of these PDF converters are actually not great. Is it possible to log in from remote location via VPN without detection? That's a very good question. Yes, it is able to do that. However, if you have it depends on how strict your security team is. Believe me, your security team knows everything that's happening on your computer. They know what you're searching, they know what you're browsing, they know how much time you're spending. So if you're watching YouTube on your work computer, they know. They just aren't saying anything because they're not trying to micromanage. But they can probably figure it out if you're VPNing in. Now, if you work at a big company, they typically will want you to VPN anyways, because then that means that you're being safe, especially if you're working from home. However, if if you are using your own VPN or a different VPN, they can probably see where your closest VPN node is. Because what happens with a VPN is it goes to your nearest VPN node, and then they say, oh, looks like you're VPNing from XYZ. If never trust, always verify. Why there is internet cookies which save your username and password. Oh, asking the good questions, Ling. Okay, let's chat about this. So when we're talking about never trust, always verify, yes, that is not the best. That's not like the best scenario because it does save your username and password and cookies, and it does save it on your browser. However, that's done because some of these companies are trying to make it more convenient for everyone. Because if you have to type your username and password each time, then it becomes hard. Now, the benefit is that MFA solves this. Because even if you have your username and password, MFA says, hey, we want to double check that you are who you say you are. Okay. So that never trust, always verify is still relevant because even if your password, username, and password are saved, we still want to double check you, which is why we have MFA in place. Okay, let's go through two more slides here. So there is something called network segmentation, like I mentioned before. So network segmentation is essentially where you are separating people into different quote unquote buckets. The way I like to think of it is you're dividing your network into smaller, more manageable sections. An easy way to see it is through departments. So you have a sales department, you have marketing, you have HR. These are three separate networks that you can put them on. The benefit is that if sales gets hacked or one computer gets hacked, well, then they can't pivot into HR's network. The reason why is because you're segmenting the network, meaning that they can only access certain things in that specific lane. Now, the benefit of this and why it's important is that if an attack happens, they can't jump into a different zone. Okay, this is a part of reducing the impact. So if you were to get a hack, it would just be one computer or one department. It would be a lot worse if it became 3 or 4 departments. The more you get compromised, the more expensive it becomes. So network segmentation is one of the ways to protect that. So now you have two things. If someone says, hey, what are parts of cybersecurity that are important, specifically threat mitigation? First, you can say access control, and then you can say network segmentation. These are two things that you can already tell your friends and family about cybersecurity. Now, what are the benefits? One of the first things you want to do if an incident takes place is you want to contain the situation. So you identify it and then you contain it. When you contain it, that means it's like if an infection were to take place, one of the first things that people do is they try to contain the situation in one specific zone so it doesn't impact everything else. Same thing here is you want to contain the threat to one specific zone. That's what network segmentation does. It puts it all in one place. The next thing is data segmentation. For example, if you have the sales team, they have customer data, right? But that customer data is not the same as, like, say, HR data. So social security number, medical information, right? So all of these are very important. And so you're separating and segmenting the data. That way they get the customer informations like phone number, email, first, last name, that kind of stuff, which is not great to be exposed. But if health information or personally identifiable information is exposed, well, then that would be something that could endanger someone's life. Therefore, it segments the data so that not all of your data is in one place where the hack has access to everything. The opposite of network segmentation would be if you just had one massive bucket and that bucket had credit card information, first name, last name, addresses, health information. So if you didn't have network segmentation, the hacker would have access to everything as opposed to just a small piece, which has a lot smaller of an impact. And then there's improved incident response. What does this mean? Now, if an incident happens, well, then the blue team has to react to it, right? And when they react to it, well, then they can say, hey, this network segment had experienced a spike in user activity or experienced a spike in activity that we weren't ready for, that we didn't expect, which makes it easier to identify. Once they are able to identify that incident was occurring, well, then they can go ahead and either shut that down or cut off any other access from inside the network to go into the rest of the network. It's essentially an easy way to proactively respond because the network segmentation already exists. Okay, before we get into the implementation piece, I think this is a good place for us to pause. We were talking about network segmentation. Well, now we talked about the benefits, we talked about what it is. Well, how exactly do you implement it? Now, we brought about the concept of the castle, right? Well, when we're trying to implement the concept of network segmentation, it can be done through multiple ways. So one of the easiest ways is from a networking standpoint. So we're going to use this awesome tool here, and we're going to draw. You all are going to get Andre's Picasso. So here you have a computer. Let's say, for example, because they're the people that I see on my screen, this is Zainab's computer. And then here we have Wayne's computer. And then we have Omid's computer. All of them work in the sales department. And then we have Sawaranjani over here, and she is in HR. Jignesh is also in HR, and then Richard is also in HR. So these are two separate departments. Now keep in mind the concept of network segmentation is we want to make sure that they have their own networks. Well, one of the easy ways to do that is essentially to say, okay, in order for you to access the internet, you have what we call a router. So the router is a network device that connects you to the rest of the internet. Keep in mind, everyone, these are going to cost about $100 million someday because I'm gonna be the next Picasso. So remember. Okay, so from here, you have these different departments, and then that's sales, and then here we have HR. Well, one of the ways you can separate them is by giving them their own specific lane. The way you do that is through a switch. So here you have a switch. Here you have a switch. Inside the switch is a network device. They're both connected to the router. And then all of these computers are individually connected to that switch. Now stick with me here. Now, let's say this computer, computer 1, wants to talk to computer 2. It can't just email them something. It has to go to the switch first, and then it goes to computer 2. Same thing if computer A wanted to talk to computer B. Well, then it goes from computer A to the switch, then to computer B. Same thing with C. Now, here, if computer number 1 wants to send something to computer number A, it has to go to the switch, which it says, okay, where are you trying to go? Computer A? Okay, yeah, you're allowed to go. Goes to a router, it does a check. Then it goes to the switch, says, hey, computer 1 is trying to get computer A. They're like, oh yeah, they're allowed to. Okay. This is a very simplistic diagram of what network segmentation looks like. Because let's say, for whatever reason, we'll say, Jagnesh, I'm going to pick on you here for a little bit. Let's say Jagnesh, who would never do this, clicks on a phishing email. So Jagnesh's computer gets infected. Okay? Here's the thing. Because his computer gets infected, well, then the infection or the malware is going to be like, oh, I'm trying to go to all the other networks. The minute it hits this switch, it can't go anywhere else because the switch has an access control list that doesn't allow any other traffic to go anywhere else. Not to mention, with this network segmentation, they also have firewalls that prevent it from going in. This is what we call different VLANs or virtual local area networks. They get divided into different zones so that one infection doesn't impact everyone. Now, what will most likely happen is we kill off access to Jagnesh from the rest of the network. And then, of course, which, by the way, Jagnesh would never click a phishing email, putting that out there. This is just an example. And in this case, we cut it off. We isolate it to just this section. Okay? When we isolate to just that section, well, then only that one computer is impacted. All the rest of the computers are safe and they're still able to operate. This is a very simple example of network segmentation. Can you all, for those of you on video, can you give me a thumbs up if this makes sense? This network segmentation? Thank you, Jagnesh. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mary. Hi. And thank you, Sheldon. Okay, love to see it. So that's just an example of the implementation of a of a um of network segmentation. You use VLANs, you use VLANs, that is what I showed you there, and then also different firewalls. The firewalls can exist at any different point. They can exist before the computer, after the computer, before the router, after the router, but this digs a lot more into network segmentation. Yes, Andre, that is a very good point. So same thing with ransomware. If any of those computers were impacted with ransomware, if they clicked a phishing email, if it was a virus or a malware, well then that, hypothetically speaking, with firewalls, with the access control list, with additional controls, it won't affect other computers. Good question. All right. Now there's something called IP tables. We're going to skip this for now, but I'll give you a quick summary. So in short, when we're talking about IP tables, it is essentially another proactive tool. It's essentially like an access control list, but it's mainly built on Linux. In essence, it filters what can access a certain network or a certain zone based on the IP address. More often than not, an IP address is essentially like the name or the unique identifier of a specific computer. So it's coming from a specific network. What will typically happen is an organization will have a list of known malicious IP addresses. And in those IP addresses, they list them out as these are the addresses that are not allowed to actually reach this specific zone. Now, typically, these IP addresses will be included in what we call firewall rules. As a reminder, for those of you who may need a refresher, a firewall is essentially I like to think of it as a net. In that net, it allows or doesn't allow certain fish. In this case, the fish is traffic or IP addresses. So the traffic all has a specific IP address, and then it does what we call packet filtering. Now, packets are what we call data or traffic that has been sent on a network. This is a bit more granular. We'll talk more about this. For those of you who are more technical and are familiar with the OSI model, this is what we're talking about. But to simplify it for now, um, packets are what we call pieces of information that are sent over a network. So you have to configure these IP tables to allow or disallow certain bits of traffic. Now, I won't dig into this too much today because you'll be able to run through this on your own or in the labs, I believe. I don't want to spend too much time because we only have about 45 minutes because I want to leave time for us to do the survey as well as do the Kahoot, which we have pulled up already. But in essence, it's essentially putting IP tables in place, adding certain IP addresses, allowing or disallowing them, and taking the steps to do that. Okay. I think we want to save this for later. All right. So now let's talk about some security techniques and enforcements. So the first thing I want to do is when we're talking about security techniques and enforcements, these are just what are the controls that you want to put in place. A control is essentially a configuration or kind of like a roadblock that protects information or that is a security measure per se, right? So some of the things that you want to do, some of the defenses that you want to include is essentially something called configuration hardening. That means turning off any systems or services that you don't need. Okay. An example, if you remember, I talked about one of the first things you want to do in cybersecurity to protect your network is to turn off any ports or services that are not required. So that's things such as Telnet, FTP, and HTTP, although you do want to keep HTTP on for some of the reasons. Okay. Oh, thank you, Emmanuel, for bringing that up. Okay, so let me bring up a diagram. DMZ network. This will be a little easier to show. Okay, so so Emmanuel brought up oh, that is tiny. Let's find another. Okay, yeah, this should be good. Okay, yeah, this is one. Okay. Now, a DMZ stands for demilitarized zone. Now, the demilitarized zone is essentially a zone in your network that is visible to the quote unquote entire world. Okay. So, what essentially that means is if you have a network, right? Here, this is your internal network. You know that because it's behind this firewall here, okay? Typically, there would be a couple more devices that would be set controls here, but this is your internal network. This is where you would have like certain servers and certain internal things like internal documents, whatnot. This is your internal network. You have a firewall here that allows or disallows traffic. Typically, it'll say any traffic that's coming from the internet will not be allowed to pass through here. Only our internal internet can access it. The demilitarized zone, which is this location, is where you want to put anything that is public facing. A very simple example is a web server. That is what this www is. That means it is a server that is essentially only used to host your website. If you're a business that sells something, well, then you would want this to be accessible to the internet. Now, this firewall says no one can get into this LAN with this IP address, but non-malicious traffic can go to the demilitarized zone. The demilitarized zone just means that it is a lightly secured location. It is pretty secure, but it's a lightly secured location that is accessible to the public. This is not the demilitarized. This is internal. So think of the demilitarized zone as like a public facing zone in your network that people can access. Very simple example, a website, a web server. Now, I don't want to dig like too deep into this because then it'll become a networking class and that does become pretty technical. We are going to go through the security infrastructure and architecture in a couple weeks. So that's when we'll dive more into networking and these devices. Now, if you're looking at this diagram and you're saying, I'm so confused, I don't know what this is, I don't know what these devices are, that's completely okay. We'll walk through it step by step. If you're going to remember anything from this diagram, just know that the demilitarized zone, DMZ, is where you host the website so that the internet can access it. The DMZ is different from the internal network. This is where the company or the enterprise has all of their internal files and where they send and use internal tools. It's more protected, a lot more protected. But the DMZ, it's where everyone can actually access it. Great call out, Emmanuel. So that is Keith, I hear what you're saying. In short, this is Ethernet 0, this is switch 0, Ethernet 1. It gets a lot more technical than that. So we'll go through that a little later. This is a diagram that's typically used um by Cisco. So I would say don't worry about that too much for now. Is the SolarWinds breach related to configuration hardening? No, I don't think so because what happened with SolarWinds is the DMZ, it's their website, right? But what happened with SolarWinds is they passed their security measures and they got into the internal systems. So it's yeah, it's a little different. I think. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I don't remember for a fact if they you were some unused features that were turned on, but if one of the TAs could double check that for me, that'd be great. And then you can comment on that. All right. Oh, let me bring this back up. So pulling this back here, let me close this. Let's get back on track. I love all these questions, y'all. Keep it up. All right. So configuration hardening just means turning off any unused features. And then areas of focus, you want to make sure that you focus. Areas of focus is essentially saying, okay, we're trying to make sure that we're secure. One of the first things you have to do is we need to prioritize what systems, what softwares we want to make sure to keep secure. Well, then that means pointing out, okay, we need to make sure our operating systems are the ones that have all the right controls in them. the applications that keep our business running. We want to make sure that we still have internet. So we want to make sure our network devices are still operational, followed by our cloud environments, because we still need access to the cloud in order for us to do our work. So automation tools, this is things that you would use to make sure that that software that keeps security measures consistent. So think of it this way. If you have a network and you're trying to put security measures on all of your individual devices manually, that takes forever. More often than not, you will have a tool or a software that dissipates all of those security settings to all your devices. Think of it as if you have like 5 work computers, you'll have an automation tool that says, hey, all your computers are out of date. You need to update them, as opposed to each individual person needing to update it one at a time. More often than not, it should update automatically, which is why sometimes you get unwanted updates. Then you want to make sure that you check in on your cloud providers. You want to make sure that there's some pre-configured settings. And yeah, okay. Patching. In very simple terms, patching is just updating your computer. More often than not, a patch is to protect you from probably a most recent breach or a most recent vulnerability that was found. So you want to make sure that you patch to plug any of the leaks. That's all it is in very simple terms. Now, I don't know if you know this, but I kind of have a fascination with castles because when I was younger, I thought, oh, I want to own a castle someday. And then when I looked up how much it costs to build it and maintain it, I said, I don't want a castle anymore. The reason why is because a castle needs constant upkeep. If you want to have AC or heating in your castle, it'll cost you millions of dollars. Trust me, I looked it up. I built a whole business plan on how much it would cost. And so, what similar to this, to upkeep a castle, you need to make sure you have regular patching. You need to regularly apply security updates, software updates to make sure that it's functioning properly. Now, in order to do this, again, because we're thinking about enterprise, right? When we're thinking about enterprise, we're thinking about a huge organization that could have up to 6,000 computers. Well, how exactly can you patch 6,000 computers? You need to come up with a strategy. More often than not, that strategy has to be automated. It cannot be manual because 6,000 computers to update. And if there's an update that comes out every Tuesday, Patch Tuesday, well, then that is a lot of updating to do. If you're curious about what I just mentioned, Microsoft, they have this thing called Patch Tuesday, meaning they always send out an update on Tuesdays. The reason why they pick Tuesdays is because it's in the middle of the week. It's right after Monday where they can double check that the patch is going to function. They do all their checks. They send it out on Tuesday and then they monitor it Wednesday, Thursday. They don't want to launch it all over the weekend. There are some patches and some updates that are done like all the time. But yeah, is subnetting used in network segmentation? Martin, that's a great question. Um, I would argue that it could be, but that gets pretty technical. Subnetting is just a way to give an IP address to a device. Like, sure, it is somewhat of a function of network segmentation, but I think of it more as just giving an IP address to a device. Okay, so I think. Okay, so to answer your question, Abdul, let me make sure I'm not contradicting Mary. Okay, yeah. Mary, okay, great. Thank you, Mary. So yes, I would say to your question, was it due to like okay, no, someone else asked. Solar winds. Just double checking. Okay, yeah. So WannaCry was happened because there were unpatched systems. Now, I know that some of you are thinking every time you get that update that says, hey, you need to update your system, well, then it gets, I'm not gonna lie, it gets annoying. The thing is, if I've learned anything, I used to be one of the people that says, why do I have to change my password? Why do I have to keep updating? After I learned all of the impacts of an unpatched system or when your password gets breached, I'm like, I will 100% spend the extra 3 minutes to MFA. I'll spend the extra 10 minutes to update my system because I'd rather be safe than sorry. The more you learn about the hacks that can happen, the more I'd be surprised if it didn't scare you to say, okay, I'm going to make sure to update as often as I can, because that's a way to be more secure. All right, let's continue. Decommissioning. So what exactly does decommissioning mean? Anytime you're working in an enterprise environment, there is a requirement to decommission or retire or remove old systems. A very simple example is if you as an employee have been at the company for 10 years and you're still using the same old computer. At some point, that computer is not going to work as well. It's going to slow down. Maybe it's not going to support some of the new applications that came out. So you have to decommission or properly get rid of that system. Is patching system not automated? Emmanuel, that's a great question. When we're talking about enterprise, more often than not, they do have an automated patching system. An example is I worked at a company where if your computer was out of date, well, then they would send you a notification saying, hey, you need to update. You can either do it now, you can do it later tonight, but you have to update within this period of time. So it is automated notification, okay? Whereas the opposite would be if they say, oh, we'll just let the Microsoft tell you when to update. That means that it's not automated, it's ad hoc. It should be automated because then it's actually adhering to several compliance standards as well as as well as making it a lot easier and more efficient. Now, when it comes to decommissioning, that means getting rid of an old system. Keep in mind that some of these systems, such as servers and computers, they have hard drives in them that still have company data. And so if you want to make sure to get rid of it properly, there are some steps you need to take. For example, you have to make sure to have a decommissioning process and procedure. You need to make sure that you save any information on those devices that you are decommissioning. Then you have to walk through the process of, okay, if I'm decommissioning this device, I need to run through all these proper steps. That means making sure to wipe the data, remove any network access, and then physically destroy it. This is where cybersecurity gets fun. You get to play with fire. Now, I say that because more often than not, or you incinerate any of the devices you're not using. You can smash it up and everything, but I've dumpster dived before when I've tried to pen test a company, and I'll find sometimes I would look for like HR information that would put back together. Sometimes we'd look for hard drives that you didn't properly get rid of. Because if you take the hard drive, you can still get the information. Not everything is not completely deleted. End of life systems, that just means systems that are super old or unused anymore. How do you get rid of them? And then there are some data privacy regulations. So if you have some servers that are hosting PII data, well, then you need to know what data is being stored on them because um, there is a set amount of time that you can keep it. Updated and patches are easily cracked through attacks. Um, I'll let one of the TAs answer that. You might have to expand on that a bit. Will the patch impact other software integration and third-party applications? Richard, that is a great example. So, do you all remember several months ago when all of the flights were shut down and no flights were able to leave because all of the windows at the airports, they were all the blue screen of death? So that was because of a company called CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is a cybersecurity company and they released a patch for Windows, but that patch was not compatible with the newest part of Windows. The only way to fix it was to manually reset it. There were even some work computers that were not able to function. So those updates can impact other software and integrations. I'm sure you've run into it where you tried to use an old application on your computer after you've updated and it said, hey, this is no longer compatible. So yes, that definitely happens. During switching. Yep, Druidge. Yes, you're right. It does become it can become vulnerable. All right, let's carry on here. If you're going to remember anything about decommissioning, you need to decommission it properly. That means that you need to make sure that you have backups on it, you pull access from it, you completely delete it, and then you completely wipe it, and then you burn it. Either you burn it or you break it down into tiny itty bitty pieces, as in like it becomes powder, so that no one can actually see any of the electronics or dig anything up from there anymore. All right, encryption. So, encryption sounds like a fancy word, but in short, it's just making something unreadable. That's the easiest way to explain it. It means scrambling data so that humans cannot look at it and see what it is. So, that's a very simple explanation of it. There are different types of encryption, symmetric and asymmetric, as well as hybrid approaches. So that means having one key that decrypts it or having two keys. So one is public, one is private. And we don't have to dig into that too much right now. Just know that that exists. You'll learn more about that later. The benefit of it is when you encrypt files, well, then you are adhering to data privacy laws, making sure that only certain people have access to it. You also are working with confidentiality and integrity, meaning that it hasn't been altered. A lot of hospitals, what they'll do is they'll encrypt all their patient data because they're trying to protect it from breaches. Then there's something called endpoint protection. So endpoint protection is something like an antivirus or anti-malware. Maybe it's behavior monitoring, meaning that it's protecting that data at the end. And then it's also application control, whatnot. Okay. So endpoint is just on your computer. It's putting protection at that very end. And then benefits of endpoint protection. Well, some of the benefits are that it proactively protects against malware. So if your computer does get infected with malware, well, then the anti-malware will essentially run. You can detect and block suspicious activity. So there is like behavior monitoring that's using AI nowadays that we'll talk about later on in class. But that's just an additional layer or a step above monitoring what someone is doing on their computer to make sure that there's nothing nefarious happening. Encryption, endpoint protection is really good because it protects data through encryption. And then it's really good for incident response because then even if data gets stolen, well, then they can't decrypt it, as well as monitoring. If they're able to monitor behavior, well, then that helps with incident response. And then it helps with containment overall. So in short, encryption is just changing data sets unreadable to the human eye. And then endpoint protection is an additional layer that protects from malware and kind of like has a medium reactive response. Awesome. All right. So let's talk about hardening techniques. Now, when we're talking about hardening, as a reminder, hardening is synonymous with the term What's not is synonymous with the term making more secure. It means strengthening your cybersecurity device or reducing the number of vulnerabilities. That's what hardening is. So anytime they say security hardening, software hardening, hardware hardening, that's what we're referring to, is just making it more secure. So in order to make an entire enterprise more secure, you want to make sure to add as much encryption as possible. That means you encrypt any data that is sensitive, and the only way to actually view that data is to decrypt it with a key. So encryption is an important way to harden. And then we have endpoint protection. So endpoint detection and response, otherwise known as EDR, detects if there's any behavior or any strange happenings on a device, and then responds to it. This is active. It detects it and then it responds, whether it stops it in its track or it deploys an antivirus to take care of it. Now, I mentioned firewalls before, right? And in the diagram, I showed you a firewall on a network. So typically, a firewall can be put on either side of a network device. It could be before a router, after a switch. This goes into networking. However, in this case, there's something called a host-based firewall. So a host-based firewall essentially controls incoming and outgoing traffic. A host-based firewall is actually one of the ways you can protect from data exfiltration. Sometimes someone will try to send an email with a really big attachment, and in that email, it has customer information. How do I know this? We saw it happen at one point. An employee was trying to sell customers to a competitor for money. Obviously, we took the right measures, but a host-based firewall essentially can monitor for any of that unauthorized sending or unauthorized visits. Intrusion prevention. So there's something called intrusion detection. Um, somewhat of a VPN. So Martial, that's a good question. A VPN isn't really a firewall. It doesn't like detect what comes in and comes out. Some next gen VPNs can do that, but in essence, a VPN just puts a tunnel around your traffic. So it doesn't control what goes in the tunnel, but it protects the tunnel, meaning no one can see into it. That's a very good call out, though. So we have what we call intrusion prevention. This is actively preventing an intrusion from taking place. There is also intrusion detection, where it just detects it, it lets someone else know. And then there's disabling ports and protocols. So this is disabling any unsecure ports and protocols that exist out there. Unsafe protocols such as like Telnet, FTP, or HTTP. These are all unsecure. Whereas more secure things is like SFTP, SSH, HTTPS. Those are all more secure protocols that function. If you're thinking, what is a port? What is a protocol? I'll put it very simply. Inside a computer network, you have like certain lanes. If you're looking at a highway or a road, there's one specific road meant for a specific service. A very common one is called FTP, which stands for File Transfer Protocol. Now, file transfer protocol is just a very simple way to imagine it. It's like taking a file, dragging it and dropping it into a folder. That can be like file transfer. Now, when you do this on a network, it's just very unsecure. You just boop, drop it in. Very unsecure, right? Whereas if you do SFTP, it stands for Secure File Transfer Protocol. It means that you're doing it in a zone or in an area that's a lot more secure. When we're talking about ports and protocols, it's saying, hey, shut down this lane that's only meant for FTP, shut down this lane that's only meant for Telnet. Telnet is an unsecure way to remote into a computer. Just like keep it at that. And that's what a protocol is. Each protocol and each service has a port number associated with it. So for example, something called NTP stands for Network Time Protocol. It synchronizes the time across all of your devices on your network. That has a specific port number. It's port 123. It's something that you'll need to memorize for when you take the Sec Plus. Okay. So you'll learn more about this later on. Changing default passwords, that's pretty rudimentary. Anytime you get a new device, new Wi-Fi, new computer, change the password. Software removal, so you just remove or delete any software that is either unused or unsupported. This is just a way to make your computer more secure because if that software is not being used and then they get hacked and that somehow gets onto your computer, well, then you could have avoided that by just removing that software altogether. Okay, Mitesh, I hear your question. Okay. In simple terms, you can put a firewall anywhere. It can go between a switch and a router. It can go between the end device and the switch. It can go between the ISP or the internet and the router and after the router. Sometimes you'll see it as there's a firewall, an internal firewall, and external firewall. You'll see a firewall between each internal and external point in a network. So it can really go anywhere depending on how much you want to filter your traffic and how uh, how secure you want to be. Keep in mind though, the more firewalls you have, the more traffic is going to be delayed, which means in very simple terms to the end user, our internet is slow. So it all depends on what the organization wants to. Let's carry on. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about proactive threat mitigation. Let's talk about reactive threat mitigation. In very simple terms, reactive threat mitigation is just when you are responding, an incident has already happened. It doesn't matter about all the proactive steps, an incident happens. A very easy way is someone clicked on a phishing email. Well, if they did that, well, then that means that the incident happened. Now it's up to us to fix it. Now, the way that we're able to find out that an incident happened is through continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring is essentially watching the devices on your network and seeing if there are any suspicious activity. Maybe someone is trying to log into a user account 1,000 times in 1 minute, which is physically impossible for a human. That is a red flag. And by monitor, we're like, hey, we think that something fishy is going on here. So reactive threat mitigation is just reacting when an incident takes place. One of the first things that we need to do, I know some of you mentioned you were interested in incident response, is incident response planning. That means you need to come up with an incident response plan. In this case, it would look like a playbook or a document that says, hey, if an incident were to take place, these are the steps that we need to take in order to make sure that the incident doesn't get worse. So more often than not, it'll follow these 5 steps. Now, there are different iterations to this, okay? The first thing you need to do is you need to prepare. This typically happens when you're building the incident response plan, also known as the IRP. So the incident response plan is when you're saying, hey, we need to build it. We need to show our stakeholders and our auditors that we do have an incident response plan and that you take the steps to put it in place. So that means identifying people and teams that will be responsible for it, defining the roles, and then making sure you have the right communication channels. This is really important, establishing the right communication channels, because when an incident happens, the key element here is information and communication. The people that are in the incident response team need to know what happened, what's happening, and what's being done. This is why you need to clearly state, hey, if an incident happens, you have to reach out to this person. This person has to post on this channel or create this channel in Slack so that everyone knows where to go to be informed. More often than not, in this stage, you would probably do what we call incident response testing. That means you can go through a walkthrough, or you say, hey, let's pretend like we're having an incident, and you run through it. Then you have to do detection and analysis. So this is where you monitor the systems. If you detect that an incident is potentially taking place, you'll go through a vetting process to see if it's actually a valid incident or not. And then you would want to collect evidence for it and then raise the flag saying, hey, we have an incident, followed by the root cause. Once you know you have an incident, you have to do 2 things. First, you have to contain it. This is the concept of network segmentation and lowering the impact. The containment is meant to make sure that the incident doesn't become worse. So the containment piece is how you do that, followed by eradication. Eradication is where you delete or where you get rid of the threat entirely. If it's a ransomware, you either get that server and you shut that server down and you bring back up the old version that hasn't been impacted. That means you bring up a backup. Or if it's a virus, you send out an agent to kill the virus. That's what we mean by eradication. Now, sometimes you don't want to eradicate it completely because maybe they're using something there. We'll talk about honeypots later, but maybe they're using an interesting virus that you want to learn more about. So you send them to a honeypot and you kind of study that virus to see what's happening. After you do that, then there's a recovery phase. After the threat is neutralized, essentially you focus on restoring backups. Typically, this is where the DRP or the disaster recovery plan comes into place. Because after an incident, if there's a disaster or if we lose something, well, then you have a certain amount of time in order to bring it back up. This is called RPO and RTO, recovery time objective and recovery point objective. The simple explanation of both of those is you give a definition to how much is tolerable for it to be down. As in, hey, we just had an incident. We can't access Salesforce, so we're losing money, and it becomes catastrophic after 4 hours. So it needs to be back up in 1 hour. That's kind of like a measurement of time for resilience to give a measurement and say, hey, in the recovery phase, we need to be back up in 1 hour. And then there's a post-incident review. This means, this in short can also be called a post-mortem. That means that you look at what happened in the incident, you look at what was deployed, you look at the fix, and then you do what we call a lesson learned. With a lesson learned, you typically come up with a list of lessons that you want to incorporate or that you want to improve for the next incident. The idea here is it's iterative. The more of these you do, the better your incident response plan will become. Obviously, incident response is really important. The reason why is because it minimizes the impact, it enhances resilience, meaning that you are more prepared for security incidences, and then you protect your reputation because when an incident happens, it damages reputation. When reputation goes down, well, then typically what follows is a lot of bad PR and a lot of potentially lawsuits and a lot of money. And the last one is requirements for compliance. A lot of the compliance standards, including SOX, require you to have an incident response plan as well as others. It's a very simple request. Typically, it'll be a document, and if an auditor is auditing you, well, then you present it accordingly. Okay? That is an incident response. Now, if you work in blue team, which means that you're responding to an incident, this is typically what you'll run through. I do want to show you this. Sec plus incident response plan. Now, there is a find this one. Okay. So when you're working with an incident response plan, this is from CompTIA. So this is one that does that's for CompTIA Sec Plus. They have a similar process that you can look through. I'll put this in here, that way you can review it. But it essentially gives information on the incident response plan and how to build it out, in case you were curious. All right, let's carry on. Just a couple more slides here. So some of you said that you were interested in business continuity and resilience. So there is an entire industry out there called GRC. GRC, in short, stands for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. So governance, risk, and compliance is all about proactive threat mitigation. That means that you're not reactive, you're proactive. The benefit here is you are implementing controls and trying to be compliant with a bunch of regulations. So I like it because it's less reactive to an incident and more proactive, and typically the hours aren't as crazy. So GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about BC or DRP and BCs. Now, specifically, disaster recovery and business continuity falls under the resilience piece. Resilience is part of GRC because you want to make sure that you are resilient to any incidences that happen. More often than not, you'll see DR and BC, which stands for disaster recovery and business continuity. These are two entities in and of themselves. They are essentially like they do a function of protecting the business, but they're their own entity. At times, you'll run into something called a BCDRP, which stands for Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plan. It just merges both of them into one. So what exactly is disaster recovery? Well, in short, disaster recovery is just getting your systems and data back online after there's been a major disruption. So as you can imagine, if there's been a disruption, you want to make sure to bring it back online, which means you need to have what we call a backup. A backup is where resiliency comes in. It means that you have backups on backups on backups. That means if you have a web server, well, then it has a backup from yesterday. That means if today it gets hacked, well, then you just shut that one down and bring up the backup from yesterday. Sure, it might be a little outdated, but at least you have a fully functioning and healthy version. Then there's also failover and resilience. So a failover is switching to a backup system when the main one fails. What happens typically in organizations is they'll have a web server, right? That is their main web server, but they'll have several backup web servers. Now, all of these web servers, they all do the same thing. More often than not, they'll all be receiving traffic, but if one of them fails for whatever reason, maybe it gets wet, maybe there's been a fire, well, then they'll typically fail over to another web server. This is what we call redundancy. Redundancy is essentially the having multiple versions of a thing that you can use moving forward. Testing and validation just means that you make sure that it's functioning correctly. And then infrastructure resilience just means that you have the right infrastructure to support it. Now, you remember when I said RTO and RPO, right? These acronyms may seem kind of like frightening to you, but I'll simplify it. RTO stands for Recovery Time Objective. It's essentially asking the question, how fast do we need to get our systems up and running again? How much downtime are we willing to tolerate? I used the 4-hour example before, right? It can be tiered into different levels. So one of them can be minor, meaning, hey, we don't have to have it up running in 1 hour. Nothing bad will happen. We don't have to have it running up running 4 hours. We might need to have it up and running within a day, but if it's not up and running in 3 days, then we have a problem. It's essentially asking RTO, because recovery time objective, essentially asking how fast do we need back up and running. RPO, which stands for recovery point objective, is how much data can we afford to lose in time? If you think about it, this concept of time is money, right? So every hour that goes by, that is revenue or data that we're not getting in. So it could be that a software is trying to send us data, but we're not getting the data because that software is down. So RPO is essentially measuring in hours and in time how much data we're willing to accept to lose, because that data could be really important that could impact the rest of the system. So that's disaster recovery. Business continuity is essentially having a document in place that essentially says these are the steps we need to take in order to make sure that our business continues to function. Okay, so business continuity is just a document that does that. Now, in order to build out that document, you need to do what we call a business impact analysis, otherwise known as a BIA. A BIA is typically a workshop or a session where you sit down with a team and you say, hey, marketing team, I need to understand what'll happen if you don't have XYZ. What you typically do is you identify what we call a critical business activity. The critical business activity, let's say for the marketing team, is social media. They need to have access to Instagram and to Facebook and to the website. Those all need to function because those drive leads, which in turn drive customers and potential sales. So those are critical business activities. Once you identify those, well, then you say, okay, what do you need in order to do social media? We need Wi-Fi. We need access to Instagram. So Instagram needs to be functional. We need access to Facebook. We need access to our computers. This includes physical things too. So when you interview these teams to understand what they need in order to continue to function, that will essentially enable you to come up with a business impact analysis document. This document can then be put into the BCP. Typically, you do a risk assessment as well with it. And the business continuity plan, it also serves as a light incident response plan because you have emergency response. So you have a list of activities and things that people can do. And then you have alternate operations. So if one thing isn't available, so let's say, hey, Instagram isn't available for our business. Well, then we have Twitter or we have Facebook. We can use that. So having like failovers and whatnot. And then testing and training, that's pretty self-explanatory. You test it out. What is the difference between backup and resiliency or kind of related? That's a great question. So they are related. They're essentially the same thing. Backup is no, I would essentially call it the same thing. Redundancy just means that well, let me explain it this way. A backup is essentially like an external hard drive that you have, right? It's a backup of your system, it's a backup of your files. Redundancy means a copy of your computer. If you have your one computer, right? Let's say for simplicity, redundancy means you have another computer that does the same exact thing, operates the same exact way, is the same exact software, and then you have another one. Having three of the same computers is redundancy. Having a backup of your information is what we call backup. If an attack happens with the indicator of compromise, we have to collect the evidence, isn't it? So yes, we do. So it comes under which stage of the IR plan? That's a good question. Thank you, Zainab. Appreciate you. All right. Now, like I mentioned before, these two are under the resilience banner, so which means that they are both connected with each other. So you want to integrate the plans, means you need to do disaster recovery and then business continuity planning and so on and so forth. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Let's move on. All right. I think for the sake of time, we're going to skip this. I'll let you all see it on your own. The one thing I will mention is if you don't know already, there's something called a SIEM. That stands for Security Information and Event Management System. It's essentially a centralized location where it collects all the logs of everything that's happening on your network or that is gathering alerts. Because if anyone takes any action on their computer or on your network, it gives an alert or a log. You need to centralize all this, give you a dashboard so you can see a baseline and then if there are any spikes. I think that's one of the important things to gather. And then one of the last, I think it's the last, yeah. One of the last things I'll mention is enforcing cybersecurity techniques. So what does this mean? That means making sure you have clear rules, policies, and procedures, because this makes sure that everyone knows how they're supposed to interact with their computers and how they're supposed to protect the organization. Training and awareness is really important because this is how you educate your employees on the importance of the techniques. And event viewer is a part of a SIEM. It could be integrate. It's used to integrate into a SIEM. And then you also need to monitoring and auditing. So monitoring and auditing is really important because then you get to essentially look at your system and see how it's actually functioning and working. Okay? All right. Let's go ahead and do some quizzes. Quiz answer thread. As a reminder, please comment on the thread. Question number 1. Zoom in here. Which of the following statements best describes proactive threat mitigation strategies? A, B, C, or D? Proactive. Which of the describes proactive threat mitigation? All right, I'm seeing a lot of C. Okay, for those of you who put A, it's okay, I completely understand. Because proactive and reactive, they look very much the same. The answer is C. Proactive threat mitigation is aimed at preventing incidents from happening. It would be reactive if it was implemented after an incident occurs. Question number 2. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates the benefit of using an application allow list? We touched on this very, very briefly. Remember, everyone, comment on the thread. All right. So for this one, a lot of people are saying A. Some people are saying C. Most people are saying A. All right, we'll go with A. Well done, everyone. In short, if you have an application allow list, that means that you have a list of applications that are approved for people to be able to use. Question number 3. Which feature of endpoint protection software helps in preventing malware, ransomware, and zero-day attacks? Which feature in endpoint protection helps prevent malware? I see a lot of people guessing. A lot of you are saying B. Are we sure? Okay. I'm seeing a lot of B's. So, mm, yeah, I can understand why it'd be B. So, behavior monitoring helps prevent it because if we see that someone is trying to access something that they shouldn't be accessing, well, then we can take steps. Intrusion detection, I would say it detects it, but it doesn't help actively protect it. Okay. So I understand why it would be that. It's a little iffy though. Or 2 more questions. How does disaster recovery, actually,